Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. My special guests today are two academics who are working on a book they have tentatively titled Brooklyn Existentialism. It's a book about our contemporary culture. I've read the introduction to the book and I found it to be quite stimulating, and as a consequence have invited them to be on this program. My guests today are Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at St. Francis College, Dr. Nino Langiulli, and my other guest is Professor of Mathematics at St. Francis College, Professor and Dr. Arthur DiClementi. I welcome you both to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
What I'd like to do to set the tone is to read a very brief excerpt from the introduction to the book, which I think at least sets the tone for the introduction, and I assume for the book, and then I'm going to ask these two distinguished professors and authors to comment on it. Again, this is a quotation from their book, tentatively entitled Brooklyn Existentialism. The madness of our time is intoxicating. The madness infects the mind of the culture by virtue of the culture's ruling class. It does so by virtue of the electronic technology and communication. Technology and communication are not gods, although the madness tries to make them so. The seduced believe that they are the masters of their destiny. They do not know that they are seduced, and they do not know that they are mad. They are ruled by pleasure driven to excess. Quite interesting, I think. Could you tell me, with specific examples, please, what you're referring to there in our contemporary culture?
Well, you did say that it was the ruling class. I think you used that word, but it's ruling ideas that have corrupted the culture.
Yeah.
And so it is intoxicating, obviously, because so many people have bought into these ideas, including intellectuals and academics. And the examples of Freud, Darwin, and Marx are clear examples of that. Marx was taught in the 50s and 60s as a definitive view of reality. Well, now, of course, in practice, it collapsed in Russia and in the Soviet Union and in the other places in Eastern Europe.
Do you think a lot of Americans today give credibility to Marxism?
Well,
is it an important idea in our society?
It is an important idea in that it hasn't died with the death of Marxism understood as economic determinism. It now lives in a cultural manner, and that is to say, the attempt is to transform the culture. And a very important Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, put that forward as his major understanding of Marxism. So the ruling idea of Marxism is dead as far as economic determinism means. In other words, we're not free, we are determined by our economic and social condition. Gramsci is making it a cultural matter, so that he says that the revolution must take place in the culture. The minds must be transformed, and that is what is being done by these ruling ideas. And against, let me say, what is it against, I should say? Yeah. It is against the traditional Western culture, Christian tradition, Western culture.
Yeah. Arthur,
I would like to add to that that the bad ideas are typical extensions in economics, in psychoanalysis, and in sociology, biology with Darwin, of this Enlightenment misconception, bad idea of the perfectibility of man. So we seduce the people, intoxicate them with this idea that, you know, be all you can be, you are indeed perfect, there's no, you are special. Yeah. We tell them that in kindergarten, that's where it begins. You're unique, as if you could be otherwise.
And what's wrong with this, in your opinion?
It's a bad idea.
Why is it a bad idea?
Well, you have the axiomatic statement, the conclusion that man is perfectible. It cries in the face or flies in the face of reality. It dismisses contingency, limitation, and finitude.
So are you suggesting in our culture many people have
Bad ideas.
illusions about what life is all about and illusions about human nature?
About life,
Many,
nature,
we would-
reality, space, almost everything. Almost everything. Let me just say that
Please.
we have a line. We have a line from Clint Eastwood's Magnum Force. A man has got to know his limitations, and that's the point of existentialism. And the Brooklyn part of it is that it's done with dismissive ridicule. In other words, we are saying that man is contingent, and everything in creation is contingent. It need not be. And so the point that Eastwood makes with respect to man is what we are saying with respect to moral imperfectibility. We're limited.
Yes.
So it is a fundamental notion. Christianity has it in the concept of original sin, that we are flawed, so that the Enlightenment concept of perfectibility is we regard, and we've argued about it in the text, as an illusion. And it's better if human beings live without illusions.
And it's intoxicating.
Yes. Yeah.
What would be more intoxicating than to think of oneself as limitless? It's a flight of fancy.
And what do you think is responsible for so many Americans buying
Not
into
only
this, if you
Americans,
believe,
yeah.
Western culture in general?
Western culture.
Yeah,
It's-
I would agree with that, by the
Yeah.
way. Not
It's
just
the
Americans.
unfortunate success of the Enlightenment and those that followed.
But where do people get these ideas from?
Well,
They get them from college, where minds go to die.
that's one of our lines.
Yes,
That's right.
explain that, please.
Yes.
Well, as Nino pointed out, you had the what is, I think Kimball referred to as the tenured radicals, took over the institutions, which Gramsci understood that a successful government takeover would take over the institutions.
Yes.
So during the 60s, 70s, 80s, the canon was Darwin, Marx, and Freud, whether explicit or implicit. That was the canon. Relativism, determinism, natural philosophy, materialism. Those were the prevailing ideas. Those were the ruling ideas. Anyone who criticized those ideas ended up with the C's. Anyone who, bowed to the office and of the professor, they did very well. But those are the bad ideas. In part, it's responsible for the 60s revolution, so-called revolution. But as a result of that, you had your relativism, sex, drugs, rock and roll. If it feels good, do it.
I know you're highly critical of Marx and Freud. You've already alluded to Marx and explained in part why you don't like his ideas. With regard to Freud, we know that some people consider him to be a great thinker. Before we went on camera, I mentioned that Harold Bloom, in his book entitled The Western Canon, says that he regards Freud as one of the great essayists of all time, because Freud's books tend to be short books, and he considers Freud to be a good writer and a very perceptive writer. What do you find wrong with what Freud expounded?
Well, whatever Freud said that was true was already said by someone else. For example, Plato on Eros and St. Augustine on desire. Whatever Freud said that was original was not true, such as the universal Oedipal complex. That is simply not true. There are all, and for the interpretation of dreams, there are all sorts of causes for our dreams, not simply sexual.
If I were to play the devil's
libido.
advocate,
Yes.
I would say this, and by the way, I don't agree with everything that Freud
Sure.
ever wrote or said, but some would argue that one of the contributions he did make is to talk about sex candidly and the role that sexual feelings and thoughts play in our lives, that previous generations perhaps were reluctant to face up to the role that sexual feelings and thoughts and behavior play in our lives. What would your response be to
What
that?
about Rabelais?
Can I interject something?
Please do.
Pornographers speak about sex candidly, but we don't use them to govern our development of our children, our adults, our human nature. The problem I see with Freud is that his claim was to be a scientist. He may have been a fine essayist, but that wasn't his claim. He set out to be a scientist, so he adorned himself with the white jacket, the white robe, but he produced no science. What he did produce with the unconscious was it was a psychodynamic. It explained everything. And as Karl Popper pointed out, any theory that can explain everything explains nothing. The very same interpretation of one's behavior could explain a projection or a repression. So where do you go with that? You lose all the distinctions. You corrupt the language, and you distort events and ideas. And that's our complaint. Not that he was illiterate. It was his major claim, or not his major claim, but his pretense was to be a scientist, and he wasn't. There is no evidence for any of his scientific claims.
Before we went on camera, that some academics who defend Freud don't disagree with you. Some do, of course, but some don't, even though they like Freud. But they say this, that Freud should be compared in some ways to Plato and Shakespeare, and not to Darwin and other scientists. The idea being, this is what they say, that we don't look to Plato to prove that his view of life and human nature is correct. We don't ask Shakespeare to prove, to verify that, again, what he's saying in his plays is true. And some would say, well, the same thing, the same standards that we apply to Plato and Shakespeare should be applied to Freud. Again, they are conceding that it's not a good idea to regard him as a scientist, but rather to regard him as a good writer.
A literateur.
Okay.
A writer.
Yes.
And that's the way Bloom understands him. He had an article, just recently in the Wall Street Journal saying, admitting what we have already said, that he's not a scientist.
Yeah.
And he's not a curer of psychological ills. As far as we know, according to what I've read in Frederick Cruz's book, Unauthorized Freud, there wasn't a single case, validated case of a cure in Freud. So he was not a doctor of psychiatry, and he was not a scientist. Now, if I'm going to consider him as a writer, there are much better writers that I would rather read than Freud. And Plato is one of them.
Yeah. I know.
Shakespeare is another.
But
Chaucer
also,
is another.
These proponents, defenders, apologists for Freud, they're simply pushing soft Freudianism. They know the theory stinks. It has no scientific basis. Take it out of psychoanalysis, psychology, psychotherapy, put it in the English section, put it in the essays, and see who reads it. That's not where the bad idea, it's not the syntax, content, expression, metaphors. It's not that. It's the claim, which it was the claim to be science. Now that it has collapsed, and now that it's okay to criticize Freud, they want to maintain the mantra of science by saying, well, it's unfair to call it science. Well, that's what he called it.
But do you believe that Freud has had a deleterious effect on contemporary Western culture?
Yes.
Yes.
Why so?
Yes.
Well, what about repressed memory syndrome? This lives have been ruined in court cases because experts claim that they can bring out these repressed memories. We don't even know if
Of seduction.
Of seduction.
Of that they were seduced by one of the members of their family
No, the
when
li-
they were
you know,
children.
Do you think this is a major problem in our society? Because what I'm really getting at is
What
how do you see Freud affecting contemporary Western society in a significant way today, in an adverse way?
No, the
Since you're
damage
critical
was
of him.
done.
Yeah.
The damage was done.
I will say this, and maybe we can build on it.
Sure.
That he's a psychological determinist. He says that we're not free. We are determined by our libidos. Now that's
Right.
damaging. So
right.
therefore, you absorb this idea in college when the boys and girls go to college, and then they begin to think in those terms that they're not free. I'm driven, Freudian term, drives. I'm driven. I can't help myself.
Yeah, I'm not
sorry.
responsible for my actions. These actions are the result of some repressed memory or desire.
So you would claim that if there are more irresponsible people, percentage-wise, in our society
Oh, no,
today-
there are more irresponsible people.
Okay.
We're not claiming it. That's
Well,
one can observe that.
Let's assume you're correct. You would
Okay,
attribute this.
we'll take
You would
that.
attribute this in part to Freud.
To Freud.
No,
Certainly in the 20th century.
but the acceptability of the irresponsible behavior as rationalized, or instead of developing character and responsibility, we teach them how to speak this jargon. It wasn't my fault. My father drank, therefore
Let me
I
again
take drugs.
Play the devil's advocate here. If
Fine.
Freud was seated here,
Oh, God.
I think
God forbid.
he would claim.
We'd pounce on
He'd
him.
be crying. He'd be running away.
I think he would claim that one of the significant things he did concerning sex was to talk about what he perceived to be the disadvantages of too much repression, that Freud believed if we repress sex too much, that could well lead to different kinds of neuroses. Now, before you respond, in fairness to Freud, we must also say this: he was an advocate of sublimation in Civilization and Its Discontents,
That's correct.
one of his great books. He says the great thinkers agree that we should not make sex the central point of our lives. And then he goes on to talk about sublimation and how important it is that we channel some of our sexual energy into our work, our family life, loving other people. From what we know about Freud, in his own sex life, he was probably pretty conservative. He had 6 children. As far as we know, there's no hard evidence that he ever had sex with someone else. It is true Carl Jung claimed that his sister-in-law told Jung that she had had sex with Freud. But again, we don't know that for sure. But the point I'm making is that Freud, in defending himself, would say that he did something valuable in pointing out to people that sex is something we can't repress too much. That it's true, we can't let loose completely. That wouldn't be good for us or society. We need to sublimate. Again, what would your response be to that? That he did clarify the matter.
Was that hard evidence a Freudian slip? I just was distracted by the phrase.
I thought about that
the
when I
hard-
said
the
that.
hard evidence.
Let's cut that from the tape, okay? Yeah.
But, I don't know. I mean, the biographies of late provided, I would say, enough detail for my satisfaction that he did have an illicit affair with his sister-in-law, Minna. And one then asks the question that E. Michael Jones asks in Degenerate Moderns: is this his rationalized sexual misbehavior?
But are you
Which
judging?
would, no, it's a Freudian analysis, which I don't agree with.
Well, let's assume he did have sex with his sister-in-law.
Well,
And we don't know this.
he sublimated
We
his
don't know
sexual
this.
desires
But if he did,
in his sister-in-law.
would you judge his morals simply on knowing that?
No, not at all, not at
Not at
all.
all.
We are not making that claim. We are saying the writing style is interesting. The man is literate. It's not science. And the claim that did the damage was that it was science. Now he's more or less a topic for parlor games and parlor discussions. But that's not when and where his effect
Would you
was.
discourage, both of you are professors, would you discourage college people from reading Freud?
Not at all.
No, not at all.
No, you
we just,
read
we didn't-
for not only good ideas, but to find
you
out
have to
what
read
bad,
the bad
ideas
ideas.
Okay.
are.
Otherwise,
See, because in other
I
words,
very much agree with you.
you ask,
No, we
you
don't
ask them,
discourage
you
anything.
would ask Freud to defend those ideas. For example, if you were only recently, 30 years ago, if you were to attack a Freudian doctrine, you were in denial. In other words, you were a victim of the very thing that you were criticizing.
Yes.
You see?
I'm aware of that.
And they poisoned the well of discourse.
Yeah. There was a
In
certain
fact,
political correctness.
In fact, that
Political
was the
correctness
way.
concerning
In
Freud.
fact, that was the way students were treated in the college
And that's true of
classroom.
Darwin and Marx.
What I want to do now, in our
Let me
remaining
just
moments,
I
go ahead,
wanna-
please.
yeah,
please,
let me
Arthur.
add something to that. The title of the book is Brooklyn Existentialism, which we explain is common sense realism.
Critical common sense.
Critical common sense realism. You've got to really be blind in one eye to read Freud and not have a few chuckles as to what? I want to do what to my mother? I mean, that's really where the damage was done.
Okay.
You know, so college boy Johnny comes home from school after taking a course in psychology. He's asking his mother about his sexual repression, his father about his fascination with tools,
Do you think
his
young people
sister
really do
about
this? I don't think young people would
they
do
do
that.
that. They do
they?
this.
Not
his
in my
sister
family.
about penis envy, and his
For better
brother
or
about
worse, not in my
sibling
family.
rivalry.
It is,
So
no, but you see, it's
it has
symbolic.
corrupted the
Yeah.
language.
In other words, you ask your sister about penis envy. That is a metaphor for what has been done.
And that's the source of the ad hominem put down in political discourse. You spoke about reasoned argument. You don't get reasoned argument as a rule anymore. You get ad hominem attack and counterattack. Whereas
I would argue that I believe young people, college students at least, should read Freud, but I also agree with you, with a critical eye. But isn't that the way we should read anyone?
Indeed, yes.
but our point.
There are some things, when you read Aristotle, you read it with a critical eye, and then you said, but he's right. You read Freud with a critical eye, and you say, he's
There's
wrong.
something
But
wrong
wait a
with
second.
me.
Now,
No, you say there's something wrong with me.
Aristotle, as you know, condoned slavery. Aristotle condoned
a whole
women
other
being
discussion.
subservient. Well, what I'm saying is,
I would argue with you ad nauseam on that.
let me just spend 1 minute on this, because I want to go to Brooklyn existentialism. Schopenhauer said, every genius is in some way stupid, and that's the way they show how much they're related to the rest of us. And I think that, again, if you read any great thinker enough, if you read enough of them, you will find that perhaps every single great thinker has said something that today intelligent, knowledgeable people would consider to be ridiculous. And again, Aristotle condoning slavery and the subservience of women.
Well,
and I like Aristotle, by the way.
I know.
Not for those reasons, obviously.
I would use as an example, not those, because they're controversial. There's a whole area of thought that has a different interpretation of slavery, because there's a distinction in slavery that Aristotle makes. Slavery by force and slavery by nature. And that's an important distinction.
But he did live in a society in Athens where
That's
there were
correct.
a
So did
huge number
St.
of
Paul
slaves.
accept slavery. And go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't want to
Yes.
finish it because I want to
And
get
I
to
would
Brooklyn
say, if you
existentialism.
want to complain about Aristotle, that's not where you make your complaint. He was wrong about astronomy. He was incorrect in his astronomy. It was a geocentric astronomy.
Let me
we
pick
know
up
that.
on this, because you mentioned, correct me if I'm not presenting this the way you have presented in your book. As I understand you, you believe that one of the treatments, the main treatment for the diseases of our culture is Brooklyn existentialism. And if I understand Brooklyn existentialism correct, it encompasses the ideas of Plato, Aristotle, and some outstanding Christian thinkers, famous Christian.
Augustine,
Is that true?
Aquinas,
And
yes.
Roman law.
Now
And
tell me,
Roman, yes.
which particular ideas from the ancient Greeks, from Augustine, from Aquinas, do you like? Which ideas would you like to see become more popular in our society?
Well, one of the ideas is what is known as Plato's theory of the forms, or the ideas. And what that is that differences are real. That's why we regard ourselves as realists. We're not creating those out of our imagination. They are real. We discover them. And that's what we mean by realism. Facts are to be discovered, are discovered. They are not created or constituted, as many great modern philosophers have, like Kant
Yes.
and Descartes, you see. So I would say that those are the ideas, that differences are real. I want to pick up on differences, because that's
Please.
a big concept with the postmodernists, the other. Well, differences are real.
I myself don't like very much 20th century philosophy. I'm not very interested in 20th century
Yes.
philosophy. It's mostly about language, and I'm into ideas.
Yes.
Not that I'm dismissing them, by the way, unfairly in a certain sense. Arthur, did you want to comment on this? On, again, the value of the ancient Greeks and certain Christian thinkers that you seem to like very much.
We're saying that in Brooklyn existentialism, it's a recognition that life is existential in its contingency.
Explain that. Many people watching don't understand what you're saying.
It's not
Perhaps a
lit-
better
yeah.
word is mortality. The
yeah.
sense of our mortality. As I remember that quote from from Clint Eastwood that I give.
Yes.
A man has got to know his limitations.
Yeah.
So mortality is crucial. Existing within the world, not as a spectator. You start with modern philosophy, Descartes and Kant, for example, there is the inner world of the mind and the outer world of nature. Well, that's not the case for existentialism. To use a word that Heidegger uses, Dasein. We are immersed in the world.
But one of the things I'm confused about, and we're running a little short on time, but we do have a little more than 2 minutes, is this. As I understand existentialism, and I've read Sartre and some of the people who...
That's the
The
one.
Frenchies?
No, the French existentialism.
Well, we just spent 10
that's not
seconds.
going to help you.
As I understand Sartre, his idea of existentialism was this, that life has no purpose other than what we give it.
That's right.
And through our actions, we give life meaning.
Yeah.
Now, apparently, you don't agree with that approach to existentialism, or do you?
No, we do not
No,
agree.
we do not.
Because I assumed when I read your introduction that you didn't.
And we do not.
Yes,
and
yes.
in fact, you know...
Well, then is it
we're-
existentialism that you gentlemen are talking about in your book?
Of course.
It's Brooklyn existentialism.
It's Brooklyn existentialism. It is.
How does that differ from Sartre's
Albagnano?
existentialism?
See, I mean, Albagnano, the Italian existentialist, Heidegger, when he doesn't call himself not an existentialism, the concept of being in the world, Dasein, not the inner world of the mind and the outer world of nature, but we are immersed in the world. Our minds are within the world. So Sartrean existentialism, in contrast to the big three we were talking about before, says we are absolutely free. We create our world. No, we don't. We play the hand that is dealt to us. That is a very good metaphor for freedom.
Are you saying in your book that in our culture, people have too much of an optimistic view of life and human nature, and that maybe a little pessimism would be good?
No.
Or reality.
No, that's
maybe
a
reality needs a better
that's
word.
not a. That's a mistake. It's not an opposition of a false alternative between optimistic and pessimistic. Brooklyn existentialists are happy, euphoric on certain occasions, and unhappy and melancholic on others. That's where we don't follow the language of the moderns. You create the false alternatives like faith and reason and
Religion and science.
religion and
Yes,
science.
that's a false alternative.
We don't accept that. We make distinctions and know that the distinctions inform each other and provide insight into what man can comprehend.
We're going to have to end on that note, and I would like to have you back for a future show if you would agree to it.
Sure.
Nino, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
And Arthur,
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. As usual, I would like to end the program with a thought from Henry David Thoreau. In his masterpiece, Walled In, Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. He said the following: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."